The call came on a pale Tuesday afternoon, the kind where the clouds hung low, but the air felt oddly warm for early spring. I was at my kitchen table sifting through the week's mail when Callan's name flashed across my phone. His voice was bright, rehearsed, almost as he launched straight into it. "Mama Lyra and I have a trip planned 2 weeks in Napa. We need someone to stay at the house, feed the cats, keep things tidy. It'd be so much easier if you could do it." I hesitated, glancing at my own quiet living room. The books stacked neatly by my chair, the knitting I'd left mid-row. I hadn't been away from my townhouse in months, but Callan sounded expectant, and I told myself it might be nice to have a change of scenery. "They're easy," he added. "Couple of scoops of food twice a day. They'll love the company." By Friday, I was standing at the base of their wide, clean-lined porch suitcase, in one hand, grocery tote in the other. The house loomed in front of me, modern all glass and steel edges, the kind of place that looked like it belonged in a magazine rather than a neighborhood. Inside, the smell of cedar polish and something floral greeted me. The cats. 2 massive Maine Coons came padding down the hallway, tails high, as though I'd been gone rather than just arriving. Their warm weight leaning against my legs eased some of my awkwardness. Callan and Elira didn't linger. They handed me a set of keys, a printed schedule for the cats' meals, and a note about which plants needed misting. There were hugs, a few pleasantries, then the sound of luggage wheels across the driveway. When the front door shut, the silence swelled. I wandered through the open-plan rooms, each one curated and spotless. Stainless steel gleamed in the kitchen. White sofas sat untouched in the living room, and the air carried a faint, expensive perfume I couldn't place. I set my bags in the guest room, the cats following like shadows. As I unpacked, the faint hum of the refrigerator was the only sound, a quiet that made every detail in the house seem sharper. By the second morning, I'd settled into a rhythm. Feed the cats. Rinse their bowls, open the blinds so the pale sunlight could spill across the hardwood. I watered the potted fiddle leaf fig in the corner, misted the orchids lined along the kitchen window, and took satisfaction in the small order of these tasks. Still, the house had a way of making me feel like I was walking through someone else's carefully staged life. There were no stray shoes by the door, no grocery list stuck to the fridge, not even a sweater tossed over a chair. Every surface gleamed, but in a way that felt untouched. That afternoon, I ventured into the office to dust. It was a bright room with a long walnut desk against the window and a single leather chair that looked barely sat in. As I wiped the edge of the desk, my eyes fell on one of the drawers, a deep, narrow one with a small brass lock built into the front. It wasn't shut all the way. The lock sat in its place, but the drawer itself was slightly ajar, leaving a thin, dark gap where the edge should have been flush. I leaned closer. Just beyond that gap, a flash of white caught the light paper, maybe an envelope. I straightened, telling myself it wasn't my business. Still, my gaze lingered longer than it should have before I moved on to dust the bookshelves. The faint scent of perfume hung in the air again, the same one I'd noticed on the first day. Expensive sharp at first, but fading to something powdery. It wasn't Elira's usual fragrance, at least not the one she wore around me. On the desk, a new laptop gleamed, the kind that costs more than I'd ever spent on a piece of furniture. I finished my dusting, gave the cats a late afternoon snack, and sat in the living room with a book I couldn't focus on. My eyes kept drifting down the hallway toward the office to that drawer left imperfectly closed. By evening, the house had fallen into its quiet again, the kind that seemed to press against the walls and make small things harder to ignore. On the third day, I decided the office could use a more thorough cleaning. The cats trailed after me, curling themselves into sunlit corners as I began dusting the bookshelves again. A stack of neatly labeled binders sat on the lower shelf, their spines aligned as if measured with a ruler. When I reached for the one on the end, my elbow brushed the desk and a small stack of envelopes slid off the surface. I bent to gather them, tucking each back into place, and that's when I saw it wedged just beneath the lip of the desk, barely visible in the shadows. A folder deep red, the kind used for important paperwork, with a crisp white label across the top. My name was printed there in bold black letters. For a moment, I stayed crouched, the folder halfway between the desk and my hand, my pulse steady but insistent. The cats had lifted their heads, eyes following me, as if sensing a shift in the air. I set the envelopes down and pulled the folder free. The weight of it was wrong, too heavy for casual notes, too organized for anything unimportant. Sitting in the leather chair, I flipped it open. The first page stopped me cold. A photograph of myself taken at the local grocery store just last month. The angle was candid, the light harsh, my hand caught mid-reach toward a bag of apples. Beneath the photo, neatly clipped, were documents I didn't recognize. The paper was thick, the text dense, filled with the sort of formal language I'd spent decades transcribing in courtrooms. My name appeared again and again in bold type, threaded through paragraphs that made no immediate sense, but carried a weight that pressed into my chest. I turned page after page, the sound of paper against paper, loud in the stillness. The cats shifted uneasily, their tails flicking. I closed the folder, keeping my hand on it, as though it might vanish if I let go. It didn't belong here in this house yet. It had been waiting in plain sight. I opened the folder again, slower this time, forcing myself to read instead of skim. The first set of documents was a power of attorney, broad sweeping authority over my affairs, naming Callan as the sole agent. My townhouse, my bank accounts, my medical decisions. All of it would be his to control. The spaces for my signature were blank, but every other detail was filled in down to my birth date and social security number. Behind it was a property transfer form, the kind that moved ownership from one name to another with a few strokes of ink. Mine to his. Attached was an unsigned healthcare directive declaring I was no longer capable of making informed choices. The date in the corner was fresh 2 weeks ago. The language was clinical detached, but it hit with the blunt force of betrayal. I knew what these forms could do, how quickly they could be filed, and how final their effects were. Each document was accompanied by small notes in the margins, scribbled in Elira's neat handwriting reminders to discuss with attorney schedule notary, a line with trip timing. My trip timing. As if my agreement to watch the cats was nothing more than a convenient window to stage my removal from my own life. I stacked the papers back into the folder, aligning the edges the way I used to in the clerk's office. The sound of the metal clip snapping shut felt like a decision. I wasn't ready to confront them, not yet. Not until I understood the scope of what they were planning. The cats brushed against my legs and I set the folder on my lap, stroking their fur absent-mindedly. The hum of the refrigerator carried from the kitchen, steady and indifferent, while I sat with the weight of what I'd found. By the time I slid the folder back into the drawer and pushed it closed, my mind was already moving past the shock toward what I needed to know next. That night, I sat at the small breakfast table with a cup of tea gone lukewarm, letting the folder's contents replay in my mind. The official language, the dates, Elira's precise notes, it all fit too neatly to be coincidence. I thought back to a phone call 2 months earlier. Elira's voice light, but probing, as she asked whether I'd ever considered downsizing. She'd framed it as concern for my comfort, suggesting a smaller place would be easier to manage. At the time, I'd brushed it off, thinking it was just idle chatter. Now it felt like the first stone in a path they'd been laying behind my back. Other conversations returned with new edges. Kaylin mentioning how complicated it was for me to keep up with bills, even though I'd never missed a payment in my life. Elira offering to help organize my files when I was recovering from a winter cold, her hands lingering too long over my desk drawers. The way they had both more than once dropped remarks about how I should focus on enjoying life instead of handling all the serious stuff, I set the empty cup in the sink and went to the office. Pulling the drawer open, I took the folder out again, this time with my phone in hand. One by one, I photographed each page, making sure every blank signature line, date field, and handwritten note was captured in full. I sent the images to my private email account, the one I never shared with family, and deleted the sent files from my phone. Once the folder was back in its place, I closed the drawer gently and stood for a moment, letting the silence settle. I wasn't going to act rashly. If years in the courthouse had taught me anything, it was that timing could be as powerful as evidence. I turned off the office light and made my way down the hall, the cats padding at my heels. Whatever they had planned, they believed I was oblivious, and for now, that was exactly how I intended to keep it. The following afternoon, while the cats lounged in a sunbeam near the patio doors, I walked past the office and noticed Callan's laptop sitting on the desk. The lid was closed, but the charger light glowed steady green, and the faint hum of the fan told me it was still on. I hesitated, then lifted the lid. The screen came alive instantly, bypassing any login prompt, landing me on his desktop. A window for his email was already open, an unfinished draft waiting to be sent. The cursor blinked beside the words, "Once she signs, we can..." My stomach tightened. I scrolled up to see the earlier messages, and there they were. Threads between Elira and someone named Dorian Klenn. The subject lines were clinical, but revealing competency filing timeline, title transfer coordination post-signature disbursement. In one email, Elira wrote about aligning everything with the vacation so they could move quickly before she has a chance to rethink. Another listed potential buyers for my townhouse, complete with speculative sale prices. The most recent exchange confirmed the plan. Once the power of attorney was executed, they'd liquidate my accounts to fund a brewery investment Callan had been chasing for years. I copied the most incriminating messages into a blank document, then sent it to the same private email I'd used for the folder photos. After making sure nothing remained in the laptop's clipboard or downloads, I closed the lid and returned it to its exact position, angling it just as I'd found it. The cats stirred, stretching lazily before trotting toward the kitchen for their evening feeding. I followed, my hands steady now. The anger was still there, but it had taken on a colder shape, one that could wait, calculate, and act at the right moment. By the time I filled their bowls and set them down, I'd already decided the next step. I wasn't going to confront them with what I'd found. Not yet. Instead, I would make sure that by the time they tried to take something from me, there would be nothing left within their reach. That night, I sat in the guest room with my tablet propped against a pillow, scrolling through the contact list I'd built over decades in the courthouse. Names and numbers I hadn't used in years resurfaced: former colleagues, clerks, attorneys I trusted. One stood out: Marianne Givens, a real estate lawyer who had once helped me settle my sister's estate with remarkable efficiency. I sent her a brief message, careful with my words, asking if she had time for a confidential consultation. Her reply came within the hour: tomorrow morning. My office or yours, I chose hers. The next day, I slipped out after feeding the cats, locking the house behind me. At Marianne's office, I laid out everything: the folder, the photos, the emails. She listened without interrupting, then leaned back in her chair. "You have two advantages," she said. "They haven't acted yet, and you still have full control of your assets. If you want to make a move, do it before they return." By the time I left, we had a plan. My townhouse and all associated accounts would be transferred into a living trust with myself as trustee and Marianne as successor. Any attempt to sell or access them without my approval would be legally impossible. I spent the afternoon gathering what she needed: property deeds, account statements. Identification documents. Years of keeping my records organized paid off. I had everything in neat folders ready for her to file. When I returned to Callan's house, I tucked the originals into my suitcase where they would stay until the trust was complete. The cats greeted me at the door, winding around my legs as if nothing in the world had shifted. I fed them, refilled their water, and sat for a moment in the stillness, feeling the weight of the day settle. I wasn't rushing, but each step brought me closer to a place where their plans could no longer touch me. And once that was done, I'd decide how to let them learn just how far from oblivious I'd been. 2 days later, I met Marianne again to sign the trust documents. Her assistant, a brisk woman with silver-framed glasses, notarized each page as I worked through the stack. The language was airtight. Everything I owned was now under the trust's protection, and no one but me could touch it. Marianne handed me a clean copy and placed the originals in a sealed envelope for safekeeping. On the drive back, I stopped at my bank. The manager, a man I'd known since my years handling court deposits, greeted me warmly. I explained I was restructuring my accounts and requested that all correspondence be directed to my post office box instead of my home address. He processed the change without hesitation, adding extra verification measures to every transaction. Before leaving, I withdrew a modest amount in cash, enough to cover any immediate expenses without triggering suspicion. I placed it in a plain envelope in my handbag. It was a habit I'd learned from my father: always keep a reserve outside the system just in case. Back at the house, the cats were sprawled across the couch, unbothered by my absence. I gave them their dinner and settled into the office, not to snoop this time, but to leave everything exactly as it had been. If Callan or Elira returned early, they would find no sign I'd touched a thing. Instead, I opened my tablet and drafted a short letter to myself detailing the events of the past week: the folder, the emails, the trust. I printed it at the small home printer they kept in the corner and signed it, adding the date. This would be my own record, in my own words, should anyone ever try to twist the story. By nightfall, the envelope with the letter was sealed and tucked into my suitcase, beside the originals of my trust paperwork. The house felt no different, but the balance had shifted. I no longer felt like a guest waiting for instructions. I was the one moving the pieces now, and as I lay in bed, the beginnings of an idea started to form, one that would turn their own timing against them. They came back on a Saturday afternoon, sunlight slanting through the high windows as the sound of luggage wheels scraped across the driveway. I was in the kitchen feeding the cats when the front door opened and Elira's voice floated in, warm but edged. Callan followed his smile, quick but thin. "Everything go smoothly?" he asked, setting his bag by the stairs. "Cats are well fed. Plants are thriving," I said, evenly. "No trouble at all." Elira slipped past him, her eyes scanning the living room in a way that felt less like checking for dust and more like making sure nothing had been moved. She gave me a practiced smile. "Thanks for holding down the fort." We went through the usual pleasantries, stories about their winery tours, the friends they'd visited, yet there was an underlying tightness in their words. I wondered if they were already thinking about the steps they'd planned to take next. That evening, over a casual dinner, they'd insisted on ordering in Callan, mentioned an appointment he wanted me to come to on Monday. He called it a routine signing for some documents that would simplify things. Elira jumped in, framing it as a convenience for me, just so you don't have to deal with paperwork in the future. I nodded, offering no resistance, as though I hadn't already seen the very papers they meant for me. The conversation moved on to lighter topics, but their eyes flickered between each other in small, coded glances. After dinner, I excused myself to the guest room, closing the door softly behind me. My suitcase already packed with my documents, and the sealed envelope sat by the bed. The trust was complete, my accounts secure, and the record of their intentions preserved beyond their reach. I sat at the desk writing a short note on crisp stationery, folding it neatly before sliding it into my handbag. It wasn't for them, not yet, but it would be ready when the moment came. By the time the house settled into silence, my plan had crystallized, every step aligned with theirs, waiting for the precise point where our timelines would collide. The morning of the appointment, I was already dressed and waiting when Kalen knocked on the guest room door. He wore a casual smile, the kind people put on when they're trying to hide urgency. Elira stood behind him, holding her phone like a checklist. "We'll swing by the notary first," Callan said, "then maybe lunch after." I agreed easily, following them to the car. They chatted about their trip as we drove, never mentioning what we were really going to sign. At the notary's office, Callan slid a stack of papers across the desk toward me, a pen balanced neatly on top. "Just the standard stuff we talked about," he said lightly. I lifted the first page, scanning it slowly, my silence drawing out the moment. Then I set it down and reached into my handbag. From it, I pulled a different folder, my copy of the trust documents, and placed them squarely on the desk. "These," I said, tapping the cover, "are the only papers concerning my property that I'll be signing." Callan's face shifted, first to confusion, then to a flush of something darker. Elira leaned forward, but I met her eyes with a steady calm. "Everything I own is already protected. Any attempt to sell or transfer it without my consent will be impossible." The notary glanced between us, sensing the tension. Callan tried to speak, but I continued, my voice even. "I also have records, photographs, emails, notes in your handwriting secured in more than one place. If anything happens to me, they'll be sent to the right people." Silence hung in the room, heavy and unmoving. I gathered my folder, slid it back into my bag, and stood. Lunch, however, still sounds nice. We left without another word about the papers. Back at the house, I collected my suitcase, the cats winding around my legs, one last time. I pulled my suitcase behind me toward the car, my steps steady and unhurried. Without looking back, once I reached the driver's door, opened it, and settled into the seat. As I pulled away, the glass and steel of their home receded in the rearview mirror, replaced by the steady comfort of knowing they could no longer touch what mattered to me.